Hello, my mother has been working in office for many years. I grew up listening to her stories about bosses, documents, and strange orders. That's why this video isn't just a story for the sake of use, it's a real situation with real mistakes that people make. The story is fictional and all names or companies have been changed, but essence is real, so that you can recognize yourself and not repeat other people's mistakes.
I need the shared drive password, and I need it now. That was the first Slack message I saw when I stepped off the elevator. No good morning, no context, no signature. Just a digital bark from a man who had no idea what room he'd just kicked open. The fluorescent buzz overhead suddenly felt louder than it had yesterday. It was 9:17 a.m., sharp, the office still half asleep, and yet Grant Holloway, newly minted VP of Ops, was already sprinting toward a decision he couldn't begin to understand. I stared at the message for maybe 3 seconds, then set my coffee down beside my keyboard like it might shatter if I moved too fast. That shared drive wasn't his to demand. It wasn't even theirs to access. And in 10 minutes, he was going to find out just how far out of his depth he really was. But let me rewind. I'm not the kind of person you remember at company parties. I never played the politics, never wore the heels. While everyone else was jostling for FaceTime with the managing directors, I was the one keeping the back end stitched together with a half-dozen vendor workflows no one else wanted to manage, but everyone relied on. 6 years of quiet contracts. 6 years of performance without complaint. 6 years of hearing lean from the mouths of executives who wouldn't know a pipeline dependency if it bit through their leather chairs. If you're still listening, take a second to subscribe and hit the like. It really helps the team keep these stories coming. Most people forget, but you can help us keep building by just clicking that little button. Thanks, seriously. Now, Brookhaven Capital wasn't built for efficiency. It was built for performance theater. Every report had to be automated, every audit step traceable, and every investor deck backed by metadata chains that quietly pulled from environments I'd personally built, provisioned, and maintained. Not just shared folders, entire vendor-managed ecosystems with layered credentials and embedded logic. Systems I built under my consulting LLC, Marlowe Systems. They weren't company-owned, they were licensed. Quietly, carefully, contractually. And then came Grant. The first time I met him, he complimented my documentation, then suggested we centralize all this under ops. Translation: make my life easier without understanding how any of it works. He was one of those overconfident strategists, freshly hired out of a firm that had just rebranded twice and posted leadership selfies on LinkedIn with captions like, "Culture eats chaos for breakfast." He had a watch that cost more than my rent and used words like synergies and low-hanging fruit with a straight face. In Q1, he brought in a cloud consultancy that came with a slide deck full of pastel graphs and empty promises. They flagged the shared drive as redundant, said it looked like shadow IT. He circled it in red during a team sync and called it spend bloat. I told him, gently, that wasn't just a drive. It was a vendor environment. Licensed, billed, and protected under contract. My contract. He waved it off, said we didn't need middlemen anymore, so I said nothing else. Just smiled, nodded, and watched him start removing external users and resetting permissions like a man defusing a bomb he thought was a toy. By the time he hit send on that Slack message, he thought he'd won. Thought he was streamlining, modernizing, cutting costs. What he didn't realize was that his so-called cost center was the only thing keeping compliance, audit, and IR from grinding to a halt. And that pulling the plug didn't just terminate access. It triggered a breach. The thing about men like Grant is they don't ask. They assume. He never looked under the hood, never checked the dependencies, just swaggered in like a kid flipping light switches in a house he didn't wire, thinking the whole thing would just keep humming because he said so. The slide deck from the consultants was classic lipstick on a pig work. 15 pages of vague graphs, a quick win checklist, and one bold red bullet labeled shared drive service. Redundant. Redundant. That was the word they used. Like I'd stapled a Google Drive to the company's mainframe for fun. Never mind the fact that the shared drive hosted retention policies for investor records, daily compliance queuing, and a full suite of SOC2 monitoring pipelines, all built under Marlowe Systems license, all serviced by me under contract. the contract they had in their system. The one Legal had signed 3 renewals on, the one Grant clearly never read. I watched him run his cleanup scripts with this smug efficiency, deleting external users like he was sweeping crumbs off a counter after lunch. Every click was a little more reckless, removing roles, resetting API keys, wiping out legacy access like it was old wallpaper. It was wild how confident he looked doing it, as if cleaning meant ownership, as if access meant control. He had no idea those credentials he'd just wiped were embedded in back-end job schedulers the entire firm depended on, or that resetting them without rekeying the automation nodes was basically pulling the e-brake on a moving train. So I said it once. Calm, measured, over email. You may want to verify that the shared drive isn't just internal storage. It's an externally licensed vendor environment, managed and contracted through Marlowe Systems, my LLC. He replied with 3 words. We're streamlining access. That was it. No follow-up. No legal check. Just the kind of response that tells you everything you need to know about a person, how they handle information that doesn't fit their narrative. I didn't argue. There was nothing to win, nothing to prove. If he wanted to treat the infrastructure like debris, I'd let him. I logged out of my admin panel, archived my notes, and waited. Because here's what Grant didn't realize. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I didn't need to lift a finger. All I had to do was stop answering calls. The systems were never his. He just thought silence meant absence. He thought invisibility meant expendability. He never considered that the middleman might be the reason the engine turned over at all. And I'll tell you this, when the smoke started rising, when his scripts caused processes to hang and queues to stall, he wouldn't even realize it was me he'd cut loose. He'd be too busy blaming the systems, the consultants, maybe even IT. But the truth? The minute he pulled that plug, he didn't just eliminate unnecessary spend. He fired the vendor. It was the tone more than the words, the kind of clipped, performative authority people use when they think being curt equals being powerful. Send the shared drive password. You're done. Desk cleared by noon. No subject line, no salutation, not even a fake attempt at professionalism. Just a Slack DM fired off like a pistol round at 9:17 a.m., right as I was logging in. I didn't even flinch. He thought he was ending a chapter. What he didn't know was that he was opening a breach. I sat there for a second, rereading the message, watching the cursor blink like it was holding its breath. My coffee was still warm, my inbox still open. But I already knew how this would play out. Grant thought he was cutting loose an overpaid contractor. What he was really doing was severing Brookhaven's operational backbone without a parachute. And the sick part? He'd brag about it at lunch, chalk it up as reducing third-party risk. So I responded with one line, clean, surgical, no venom, no panic. There is no password. That environment is vendor managed, licensed under Marlowe Systems. Send. Then I leaned back and waited. 5 minutes later, the hammer dropped. I was locked out. Email credentials revoked. VPN access gone. Slack grayed out. No courtesy call. No HR escort. Just a silent execution of internal access, like they were scrubbing malware. And then, 10 minutes after that, the real shift happened. Word from inside legal, they'd forwarded Grant's message to the CEO, not out of policy, out of alarm. The kind of email forward that comes with phrases like urgent review, escalation required, and potential liability. Because legal knew what Grant didn't, that environment wasn't just a digital dumping ground. It was tied to 3 separate vendor clauses, all under a standing contract with Marlowe Systems LLC. My LLC, with language that spelled out explicitly that early termination without cause and without a 30-day negotiation window constituted a material breach. No one had read that clause since it was signed. But I remembered it. I'd written it. Grant probably imagined a clean, triumphant walkout. Me packing up my desk, maybe tossing a stapler in a box, escorted by some intern from HR while he stood tall like a cowboy who'd just cleaned house. Instead, he fired a vendor without authority and without cause, by Slack message. And what that really meant was he didn't just fire me. He just breached a contract that governed every single compliance-related pipeline in the building. And now, instead of a quiet desk clear out, he had legal, the CEO, and the board staring down a vendor termination notice with a dollar figure attached. One line, That's all it took. Not a password, a reminder. He didn't own the system. He just lost it. They called it a shared drive, the same way people call a jet engine loud. Technically true, but miles off the mark in terms of what it actually does. It was never just storage. That environment held the guts of Brookhaven Capital's regulatory ecosystem, metadata audits tied to quarterly reports, retention schedules mandated by investor agreements, SOC2 evidence packets we were required to update bi-weekly, and a compliance checklist that synced with 3 different internal tools. There were routing logs for due diligence, time-stamped backups for litigation hold, and an external reporting queue that fed directly into the firm's SEC interface. Every byte of that lived in the system Grant just tried to delete with a Slack command. But here's where it gets interesting. That system wasn't on Brookhaven's books. It sat under Marlowe Systems, My Consulting LLC, which held the vendor license, the hosting agreement, and the automation pipelines. My name wasn't in the employee directory. I didn't have a cubicle. I had a quarterly billing cycle, a vendor ID, and a contract with very sharp teeth. The kind of contract you only write after you've seen what happens when companies try to streamline their way through compliance nightmares. That contract never used the phrase employee access. It didn't grant internal rights or reassignable credentials. It said one thing, very clearly. Vendor-managed services provided under proprietary license. Termination without 30-day negotiation window constitutes breach of agreement. You can't fire a vendor the same way you fire a staff member. You don't just revoke access and change a password. You don't wipe their email and expect business continuity, not when that vendor is holding the digital equivalent of your firm's blood type and medical records. But Grant? He didn't bother to read the contract, or the system logs, or the vendor ID list. He saw an external user and assumed risk, saw a line item and assumed redundancy, saw my name and assumed I was some IT contractor milking legacy access. He never once asked who built the workflows that triggered Brookhaven's investor disclosures, or who monitored the daily integrity checks that fed into the compliance dashboard, or who handled the logic map that rerouted task queues during internal audits, because if he had, he'd have seen it all pointed to the same place, Marlowe Systems. And that's the problem with shallow certainty. It lets people believe in shortcuts that don't exist. People like Grant make the same mistake again and again. They think you can own something just because you use it, but usage isn't ownership. Visibility isn't control. He thought the power was in his job title, the access list, the red pen he used to slash what he didn't understand. But the real power? That was in the footnotes of a contract he never bothered to read. It started slow, just a few red lights on their dashboard. Maybe they thought it was a glitch, some sync delay or a hiccup in a queue, but by 10:10 a.m., the warnings were impossible to ignore. Retention protocols failed to initiate. The nightly audit trail logs didn't pass checksum validation. Time-stamped entries were missing, auto-archiving failed to fire, and worst of all, the SEC upload workflow, the one they needed for the compliance reports due by end of week, was dead in the water. And suddenly, Grant's face, from what I heard, had gone from smug to silent. His team scrambled, tried rerouting permissions, tried restoring access through admin panels they didn't actually have. They went through old credentials, tried account recovery paths, even pinged IT like they'd hit some sort of ghost lock. But it wasn't a ghost. It was me. More specifically, it was Marlowe Systems. Every process they triggered slammed into the same wall. Authentication failed. Marlowe Systems' proprietary license required. They couldn't even spoof access. I'd buried the service credentials so deep in their infrastructure that even IT didn't have a map. Part of that was intentional. Part of it was just what happens when you're the only one who understands how the whole thing fits together and no one else ever asks. It wasn't sabotage. Let's get that straight. I didn't pull a plug or encrypt their data or touch a single thing once they terminated me. I simply stopped servicing it. The credentials expired per policy. The environment waited for handshake authorization from a vendor that no longer had cause to respond. Brookhaven's internal systems were built to depend on mine, not because anyone told me to do it that way, but because no one ever told me not to. Over the years, I'd patched holes they didn't even know they had. When compliance needed automated PDF redactions, I built it. When legal needed daily backups with time-stamped hashes, I deployed it. When IR wanted export-ready formats for monthly performance packets, I scripted the delivery. Quietly, reliably, invisibly. But invisibility is dangerous. It makes people forget you're there, makes them assume the system just works because it's supposed to. They never considered what would happen if the vendor left, if the hands behind the curtain folded. So when those hands finally did, the machine didn't break. It froze, rigid, silent, waiting for the commands that only Marlowe Systems was licensed to give. And no matter how many keys they tried or how many consultants they called, they were never going to force it back online. Because the system wasn't down. It just didn't recognize them anymore. The quarterly CFO call was supposed to be routine. Slides, figures, some muted pleasantries. But routine depends on preparation, and by 10:45 a.m., that house of cards was folding fast. Nobody had access to the financial artifacts. No ledger exports, no audit trails, no finalized compliance packets. The retention script that usually delivered them like clockwork hadn't run. The file paths were empty, and the backup triggers, which should have kicked in automatically, hadn't lit up at all. By 11:04, the call was canceled. Internal note just said, "Financial artifacts unavailable." Simple, sterile. But everyone knew what it meant. The data was gone, or at least gone from their hands. Internal audit tried to triage, asked IT if they could pull the documents manually or access the vendor logs. IT responded in a quiet, uncharacteristically short email. "We have no visibility into the vendor space." No visibility. 3 words that hit like a cold slap. Because what it really meant was, we're blind. You fired the only person who could see. That was the moment legal got involved, properly involved. Not just forwarding emails or scanning contract summaries, but opening the full agreement, the real one, the master vendor agreement that had been in place for 6 years, versioned and renewed without incident. And when they read it, actually read it, it didn't say what Grant had assumed. It didn't talk about shared folders or temporary admin access. It didn't mention oversight clauses or IT fallback plans. It said one thing, clearly and repeatedly. Access rests with the vendor of record, Marlowe Systems LLC. I wasn't a contractor. I wasn't an internal system admin. I was a black box vendor, a service provider with autonomy, a license, and a data environment contractually separated from Brookhaven's internal stack. On purpose. For security, for audit compliance, and for leverage. The legal department, bless them, didn't try to spin it. They just read the line out loud in the executive conference room and waited for the weight of it to settle. Then the CEO spoke. He was new, still careful in how he moved, more observer than actor up to that point. But now, he looked at the team, at Grant, at legal, and asked the only question that mattered. Who owns Marlowe Systems? Silence. Not because they didn't know, but because the answer wasn't convenient. Because the woman they'd ghosted, terminated, scrubbed from Slack, she was still sitting on the vendor license, still listed in every legal doc, every service credential, every pipeline log. I was the vendor of record, the one person who could turn the lights back on, and they'd just thrown me out the building. The apology didn't come in all caps or with a bouquet of half-wilted office lilies. It came in Helvetica. Subject line, Re-Vendor Services Inquiry. Sent not by Grant, of course, he was already out of sight, but by General Counsel herself, the same woman who once declined to join a meeting with me because vendor sessions aren't a priority. Now her tone was butter-soft, almost deferential. Would you be open to consulting on a reconfiguration of service pathways to restore operational continuity? Translation. We lit the building on fire, and now we'd like you to please hold the hose. I didn't reply, my attorney did. Attached to the email were 3 things: a copy of the signed vendor agreement, a time-stamped outline of the breach, and an invoice. $5.2 million per section 6.2b. The clause clearly stating that early termination without cause and without the required 30-day renegotiation period would trigger full penalty compensation and continuity disruption damages. No drama, no threats, just facts on letterhead. Within the hour, Grant was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. HR called it a personnel realignment due to policy oversight, which is a corporate way of saying We gave a fool a flamethrower, and now we're hosing off the ashes. The CEO finally weighed in 2 days later. His email was brief, formal, and undeniably sincere in a way that told me someone else had drafted it. We regret the sequence of events that led to this disruption. Brookhaven Capital deeply values the contributions of Marlowe Systems and extends our apologies for any actions taken in error. I accepted the apology. Through counsel. Not through forgiveness, and definitely not out of goodwill. Because by then, it wasn't about bruised feelings, it was about consequences. My company had done its job, exceeded expectations even. And when they cut the cord without looking, they'd pulled their own plug. The apology couldn't undo that. Couldn't erase the meeting cancellations, the SEC reporting delays, the audit trail gaps that now lived forever in their quarterly filing notes. But it could trigger reinstatement. It could put the environment back under service, with better terms and clearer boundaries. And it did. The price of arrogance, as it turns out, is billed net 30. They didn't call it a reinstatement. They called it an emergency operations agreement, because God forbid anyone admit they made a mistake in plain English. But at the next board meeting, there it was. Item number 4 on the agenda, sandwiched between fiscal projections and asset restructuring. Reinstatement of external vendor services under critical continuity protocols. Marlowe Systems was back. Officially, quietly, without ceremony. This time, the terms were different. Termination now required 2 signatures, one from legal, one from the board. No more VP discretion. No more Slack messages pretending to be due process. If they wanted to unplug me again, it was going to take a full committee and a paper trail long enough to wrap around their downtown headquarters. Twice. Grant's name was nowhere on the agenda. Not a footnote, not a bullet point, not a whisper. He didn't speak, didn't zoom in, didn't even send a statement through HR, just gone, like a patch update that bricked the system and got quietly rolled back before anyone could take a screenshot. I don't know if they fired him or just tucked him into some strategic development role with no desk and no team, but it didn't matter. The damage was done, and so was he. As for the system, it came back online like it had never left. Every workflow resynced, every compliance packet queued, every scheduled export and pipeline handshake resumed its rhythm like someone had simply hit pause instead of self-destruct. Nothing was lost, nothing corrupted. Because I never deleted anything, never sabotaged a single task. I just stopped showing up, stopped responding. Stopped providing services I was no longer obligated, nor paid to support. The infrastructure had been patient, waiting like a well-trained dog at a closed door. And when that door reopened, it stood, stretched, and resumed its run without needing a leash. Brookhaven didn't send out a company-wide update. No one announced my name. But word got around. People noticed the environment was back, that the sync errors had vanished, that the workflows suddenly fixed themselves. A few reached out privately, quiet pings, small thank yous, unspoken acknowledgments from people who'd always understood what I did, even if they couldn't explain it in a meeting. And for the rest? Well, institutional memory has a funny way of sticking. They might forget who built the system, but they'd never forget what happened when they tried to delete it. Every Monday at 3 a.m., like clockwork, the compliance queue at Brookhaven stirs from its automated slumber and runs its checklist. It doesn't care who's on vacation, who got promoted, or who got quietly removed from the company directory. It only cares about what works, what responds, what fulfills the handshake. So it sends a ping. One line of code pointed to a vendor endpoint embedded so deep in their infrastructure, you'd need a map and a confession to find it. And that ping still goes to the same place it always has, Marlowe Systems. Not the shared drive, not some temporary admin account cobbled together by IT after the chaos. No, it reaches for the one environment that never failed, never lost a packet, never missed a timestamp. And every time, without fuss, without fanfare, the log records the same 2 words, handshake complete. That's it. No blinking lights, no dashboards, no awards for uptime or vendor of the month email blasts. Just quiet verification that the thing still works, still delivers, still matters. There's a strange kind of satisfaction in that. Not the loud, triumphant kind, the one that comes with press releases or corporate back patting. No, this is colder, deeper, the kind of recognition that doesn't need applause because it's coded into the system itself. A signature left in architecture, a ghost in the frame. Brookhaven will go on. New execs will roll in. Decks will get prettier, strategies will shift, and one day someone will suggest rebuilding the environment in-house again, probably with better fonts and worse planning. But that Monday morning, ping will still go out. And unless they rewrite every root process from scratch, unlikely, given the history, it'll still point to Marlowe systems. Not because they remember, because the system does. Because in the end, legacy isn't who claps for you. It's who still needs your name in the logs just to keep the lights on.